Tens of thousands of South Koreans once left everything behind, not for opportunity, but out of necessity. They went to West Germany in the 1960s and 1970s as coal miners and nurses, back at a time when Germany was still divided between East and West. The Korean migrants were part of a little-known deal that would help rebuild one country and transform another. But for many, it began with something much more personal. Listen to this.
When I got my first salary, the first thing I did was send money home to my mother. Don't skip meals. Take care of the house. I'll send money. Don't worry.
They worked underground in coal mines, in hospital wards, sending home money that would help power South Korea's rise into a modern economy. But behind that story of success is something more complicated. Lives meant to be temporary that became permanent. A generation that gave everything, only now being remembered. I'm Genevieve Woo, and I'm joined by our CNA Senior Correspondent Lim Yun-suk in Seoul, who reported this story and spoke to the people who lived it. Yun-suk, tell us, what first drew you to this story?
Well, a few years ago, I went on a holiday and I visited this place called Namhae, and it's a beautiful county on the southern coast, not very far from Busan City. And in Namhae, I found out that there was this place called a German village. And I had no idea what it was. I didn't even know that a German village existed here in South Korea. And so I went to visit this place, and the houses there, they looked very German. The street signs, they were all in Korean and in German. There were restaurants selling German food, and then there was also this area, an exhibition center, where they had exhibits of letters and personal belongings, all belonging to the nurses and miners. And there were stories being told about these miners and nurses here in South Korea. And in Korea, they're called padok, meaning dispatched to Germany. So I became fascinated by this and wanted to tell this story for some time now. In a way, before, there's no one left to tell these stories because many of them are now in their 70s and 80s. And so I was worried that this generation is going to disappear. And I felt that, these people gave so much to their families, but also to South Korea. And that's why I decided to do this story.
Now, this is a chapter that not many people know about. Can you walk us through this arrangement between South Korea and West Germany at that time?
This whole story starts in 1961 when the two governments decided to reach this deal. And then from 1963, when South Korea started sending the miners and nurses to Germany. But, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world and also in Asia because it was just rebuilding after the Korean War that ended in 1953, and it left the country in devastation. Now, South Korea had no foreign loans. There were no foreign currency reserves. And this economy was, in a desperate state. Meanwhile, West Germany was going through this rapid economic growth, and it needed a lot of workers, especially the miners, willing to go underground in coal mines. So the two governments reached a deal, and South Korea said, okay, we'll send you the miners and nurses on 3-year contracts. In exchange, Germany agreed to provide loans to South Korea. And so about 20,000 South Korean miners and nurses ended up going to Germany. And, they sent most of their wages home. They worked very hard. They sent their wages home, helping the families behind here in South Korea, to survive the poverty. But also, many of the families here bought homes and were able to educate the rest of the siblings. And these wages also helped South Korea, become what it is today, what we call it the Korean economic miracle. And in a way, these miners and nurses, they all contributed to this South Korea becoming, this advanced developed country that we see today.
Now, there's also a term that I think you had used in your story called, they were called guest workers because their contract was never meant to be permanent. I think it was 3 years, you said. So who were these Koreans who decided to make this choice? What kind of lives were they leaving behind, and what were they stepping into in West Germany?
Well, yes, they were guest workers because they all signed this 3-year contracts. But they weren't simply, sort of like the desperate laborers that we think of, because many of them had university degrees, nursing qualifications, and there were even government officials who were giving up their jobs here to go to Germany because the wages that Germany was offering was about 10 times higher than the salaries here in South Korea at that time. And you hear a lot of stories when you talk to them, and they were saying, for example, to qualify as miners, they needed the mining experience, but most of the miners, the men who went, didn't have that. And in fact, Kim Chin-dong, a former miner who now heads the association representing the miners and nurses here, said that a lot of them had never gone underground before. And so just before they had to go in for the interviews, apparently a lot of them were rubbing coal dust on their faces and hands so that they could look like experienced miners. And also, to go underground to coal mines, they had to be strong, healthy looking. But, apparently a lot of Korean men at that time didn't even weigh 60 kilograms. They were very thin, weigh what the kind of Koreans that you'll see in North Korea now. And so what they had to do, a lot of them did, was like drink enormous amount of water before the weigh-in to artificially, increase their weight. And then when it was all over, they'll be all rushing to the toilet.
Well, so they were pretty much faking their resume, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
All these tricks, like you
Yes,
said,
they were.
just to get the job.
Right. And apparently one of them was saying that he had to lie and say that the coal mine that he worked in, was closed. And so he couldn't show any proof or something. But that was how desperate they were. But also talking to nurses, they said that going to Germany represented freedom for them. Because, this was a period when girls here in South Korea were not expected to pursue education. And, there were families where you had several siblings, like 7, 8 sisters and brothers. And so sons were being prioritized at that time. And, daughters usually stayed behind at home to help with the farming and the housework. And so Germany became a way out of this for many of the nurses who went, and they said they saw this as an opportunity.
Be it freedom or, the lure of 10 times more the wages. And for many, I think it wasn't meant to be permanent, but it did. It did become a lifetime. So was there a moment that this changed, or it just kind of quietly happened over time?
I think it quietly happened, as you said. It wasn't something where they said, okay, I'm just going to go stay for 3 years and come back. Although some of the nurses said that was what they wanted to do. But once they got there, they realized, no, 3 years too short. I think if I'm going to be earning this much money, I might, stay longer. But definitely there was this shortage of nurses and miners in Germany at that time. And so they were, deeply valued. And apparently the nurses were saying about how the German patients were calling them sunshine because they were always cheerful. And, some of them were also being called diamonds because they were so precious to the hospitals and also to the patients. And so eventually, some of them got married, sometimes to Koreans, sometimes to Germans, and then they started building a life there. And so, for the nurses, they really did have a choice whether they wanted to come back or stay there, and that's what they did. For the miners, I think it was a very different story because the work underground was just simply too brutal. It was just so difficult for many of them to endure, especially since, they had never had any experience before. And so, a lot of them came back to Korea because they couldn't after the 3-year contracts were over. But a lot of them also stayed behind and they started to change jobs. Some of them went into nursing. Then they started, they married, slowly building lives there in Germany.
I mean, the fact that, some of the nurses were called sunshine or diamonds, I mean, it's a good feeling, right? To be so appreciated, when you're so far from home in a foreign land and your adopted country seems to, to love you so much. And at this point, I want to bring in the story of the 2 sisters that you met. They were nurses. One decided to stay on in Germany. The other returned to South Korea. Now, their paths really diverged. Let's listen to how differently their journeys unfolded.
From the beginning, I had no intention of settling in Germany and wished to return to Korea when the time was right. What holds me back, however, are my younger siblings.
I never felt like a guest worker from the beginning. I always felt that this was a place where I could live, where I wanted to live.
내가 살고 싶은 땅이다. 그걸 항상 느꼈고
When you hear that contrast, duty versus freedom, how typical was that divide among the people that you spoke to?
I think it was very typical. I mean, I think for many of them, the decision wasn't simply as practical. It was about who they were, what they owed their families, and, where they felt they belonged. Because for that person, Imok Jin, she carried that burden. She was the eldest daughter in the family, and her brother needed an education, and she felt that she had to help the family because the family couldn't afford to send him to school. And she just felt that Germany was the only option, not just for herself, but for the survival of the whole family. And so she took on that responsibility. And although she always said that she wanted to go back home, now, meanwhile, her younger sister, Chong-hee, saw this differently. And they have very different personality too. Their characters are totally different. And she says that she never felt like a temporary guest worker in Germany. And she just felt like it was home as soon as she was in Germany. Yes, she was homesick. She missed her family. But she just felt like this is going to be my home. And she decided to stay on. She got married to a German. And quite early on, she felt that, Germany is my home. This is my husband. This is where my family is. And so, yeah, I mean, the stories of these two sisters, I mean, it's really fascinating the way that they have similar backgrounds. They grew up in the same family. They all went through this poverty while they were growing up. But then they all went to Germany, but then they ended up with totally different ideas about what home meant to them. And, I heard versions of that divide in the conversations that I had with both of them.
Now, we often hear about the economic success that followed, but your reporting also showed a different side. What did you see or hear that really brought home like the personal cost, physically, emotionally, of that sacrifice?
Well, when you talk to the miners, it really is sort of like you feel that in their heart. I mean, the things that they went through, the physical, the health cost, I mean, the lung disease, apparently a lot of them are suffering from. And, many of them talked about, going down 1,000 feet underground, working in tunnels. And they were saying that they couldn't even stand upright. And so they had to be on their knees for like 10 hours or longer. And remember, these are people who had never gone underground. They're people with university degrees too. But they felt that they just had to go, and talking to them, they do tell their stories. But, one thing that really did struck me was the silence, where these people never really spoke about the hardships. They weren't able to tell it to their families back here in South Korea. And in fact, one of them was saying that he told his mother he was going to work in a coal mine, but he'll be wearing a suit every day and not, because he just felt he couldn't tell that to his family members, because coal mines here in South Korea at the time, there were lots of accidents. One of our main profiles is this person called Martin Hyun, whose father worked as a miner. And Martin was telling me how his father never spoke about his past. And he always told him, don't look into the past, don't look back, just look into the future. And it was only when the father realized that he was running out of time did he finally start talking. And one day he said to his son, Martin, bring the camera. And he started talking about why he went to Germany, what he left behind. He recorded all of this on video, but only shortly before he passed away. And, for decades, he just kept up all that inside. And so I don't think he was alone, because I do talk to the miners, and they all have stories to tell, but they didn't want to tell everything because they just felt, a lot of them felt ashamed. They said that, that they had to go to Germany at that time too, and that the lives back in South Korea were not good enough for them to stay here. And so that's something that really, stayed with me, I think, when talking to the miners.
So possibly why he may not have wanted to talk about it, he buried, I suppose, the pain and the trauma. Maybe talking about it over the years would have just triggered, too many uncomfortable memories, which is what I want to bring up now about parts of the story that were uncomfortable, right, Yoon Suk? How these workers were treated, both abroad and back home. What stood out to you as one of the hardest truths?
But I think for a lot of the miners, they did go through this discrimination. They just felt they were the Asian face, and at the time, they were really the only ones who looked different from the Germans then. And so they did go through that hard time with in Germany, but also I think it was back here in South Korea where they just felt they weren't recognized or they weren't treated as if, sort of like they weren't thanked for the sacrifices that they went through. I think a lot of them felt that the country had just sent them away and betrayed them in a way and had forgotten them. And so, talking to all the miners, but among them, one moment that really stayed with me was this one miner who was talking about the speech that the former South Korean President Park Chung-hee gave when he visited Germany. Let's hear directly from Kim Jin-dong as to what he said.
Because our country is poor, you have been sold and sent here. My heart is bleeding.
That idea of having been sold for the country's economic survival is something that many of these workers still carry very deeply. And what struck me was that, many of them have been expecting this recognition and support from the South Korean government, but instead they just felt forgotten by their home country. Now, Kim Jin-dong spent several years simply trying to get this one memorial wall built with the names of the miners and the nurses who all went to Germany so that they would not disappear from South Korea's history. And he had a lot of trouble doing that. He couldn't get any of the government politicians or the government officials to agree to that.
But there has been some efforts to address that, right? In the German village in Namhae that you were at, there were these reunions and the memorials that you captured. Do you feel these efforts are, genuine recognition, or is there still a gap between what these workers gave and what they've received?
Well, I think that, yes, there are the ceremonies, they get very emotional, and it is an emotional moment for the people there. But, it's the people, the miners and the nurses who came out with the ceremonies. It's their ceremony. It wasn't something that the government or any other third party made for them. And so, for those miners and nurses to be seeing Korean and, German flags side by side, that is very personal to them because it represents the two worlds that they lived in. But real recognition would mean something more concrete, maybe a proper welfare support for those who returned with, damaged health or little savings. But there's none of that acknowledgement of their contribution. And, more of like, for the story, I was talking to a lot of the young South Koreans, and a lot of the young South Koreans don't even know anything about this padok, the dispatched to Germany. And so in a way, they are forgotten, and not, the Koreans now don't know about these people. And the German village you mentioned, Namhae, is a good example because, yes, there is this exhibition hall and it's filled with letters, photographs, personal belongings, all donated by the miners and the nurses. But, the workers, the miners and the nurses were saying that they just feel used because they gave all that. They got this exhibition all set up, but they got nothing out of return. Not that they were asking for something.
And so you spoke to many people across generations for this report. Can you tell us one story on one moment that stayed with you?
This man, Park Chun-gu, he's now in his 80s. He was saying that, and something that he really stayed with me is that, he wanted to come back to Korea, but he can't. And so let's hear what he had to say first.
Honestly, what I want is to go back to Korea. But even if I can manage the flight, I don't really have a place to stay. I want to spend the rest of my life there. That's natural, but it's not something you can easily say out loud.
Now, he was telling me that his wish is to come home before he dies, and he wants to die here in South Korea, but he cannot come back. He can't afford to return home. And he says the last time that he came here was, 10 years ago when his daughter helped him with the flight ticket. But he doesn't, want to burden her anymore. And he says even if he had the money to come here and buy the ticket, he doesn't have anywhere to stay. Because his parents have all passed away now. The families that he helped, they're not here now. And so, he can't come here for a week or 10 days or even longer, though he wants to, because he just can't afford the hotels, the lodging and all that. And, even for a short while, he's saying he cannot. So how can he come back here to die? He thinks it's impossible. He has this pension in Germany, and giving up that pension is going to be very difficult. And so everything's just become too expensive. And it's a joke in a way, because he went to Germany, more than 60 years ago to help South Korea become what it is now. But he can't come back to the country he built because it's just become so expensive for him. And it's not just him, but apparently there are dozens of them in Germany who do want to come back home.
I mean, that's the painful irony, isn't it, Yoon Suk, that all the money that they send back to build a country to where it is now, and yet they themselves now cannot afford the country that they contributed the success to. Thank you for that, Yoon Suk. We'll end on this note. This is the story of a generation that helped shape modern South Korea from thousands of kilometers away. Their lives stretch across Korea and Germany, but also across time, from sacrifice to silence to recognition that for many has come late. And perhaps the question that lingers is this: what does a country owe the people who helped build it, especially when their contributions were never meant to be permanent? Thanks for joining me on this episode of CNA Correspondent Podcast. It was brought to you by Tiffany Ang, Ned Vetivero, Craig Dale, Sikri Iman, and me, Genevieve Woo. Bye for now.